Hello and welcome to the second in my series on diabetes, cooking, and lifestyle. Now, as I mentioned last time, about a year ago, I was diagnosed with basically somewhere on the borderline between diabetes and prediabetes. In fact, it's so much on the borderline that in different countries I would fall on different sides of that line. In the process, I've done a very large amount of research in terms of scientific literature, medical literature, and things like that. And I've decided to try to put together a series to discuss the illness in a way of both increasing public awareness and also for people struggling with it or knowing people who are struggling with it, providing a greater situation awareness of what's actually going on. So, last week we covered a very basic introduction. I strongly recommend going back and watching that before watching this one. Today we're going to cover something a little different. We're going to cover what's called the metabolic syndrome theory of type 2 diabetes. Now, if you look at attitudes towards this illness, you start on one side, which is the scientific side, and you progress to sort of the popular literature side. And every step along the way, from the scientific side to the medical side to sort of the view that sort of illness organizations have to the view that the popular culture has, every step along that way, some information is lost. So this is going to be focusing very heavily on the scientific side. A popular side, people say, oh, you get diabetes because you eat too much carbohydrates or too much sugar. That's baloney. That's really not at all related. Diet has a really important role in damage control and disease management, but it's not what causes the disease. Now, to get to the point where we can even talk about what causes the disease, we have to understand how the disease progresses. The main scientific theory we have is the metabolic syndrome theory. This is very clearly correct in its outlines, although in some details there may be other dynamics involved, and in further programs I'm sure I'll talk about some of those. But the basic idea is that type 2 diabetes starts out with the body preventing insulin from being used properly. This leads to increases in blood sugar, which leads to an increase in insulin secretion. And eventually, the body has trouble maintaining the amount of insulin produced, and the insulin production falls. Now, the further idea is that as insulin production falls, this means dysfunction and death of the beta cells in the pancreas that produce the insulin. So, at some point along this progression of the disease, we start getting organ damage to the pancreas and then later to other organs. This is an extremely important point, and it means that when I talk about attempting to recover from this illness, depending upon how far that illness has progressed, that recovery might not be complete. So the earlier you catch it, the more completely you can recover. So that's the first point. The second point is that we need to understand then some very basic things about insulin and blood sugar management within the body. As our blood sugar goes up, we end up with more glucose in the blood, of course, by definition, as it passes through the pancreas. The beta cells in the pancreas only respond to glucose levels. So in other words, as glucose levels go up, these cells start producing more insulin. The idea, again, as you would have figured out yesterday, is to tell various cells in the body, please absorb, we have lots of sugar available, please store it for later use. But if you have insulin resistance occurring, Insulin resistance basically tells the same cells in the body, don't ignore the insulin, we need that sugar for immediate use. And there are a number of reasons why this can happen. A lot of people, as they go through this process of trying to understand these things, assume that insulin resistance is a bad thing. It's actually not. It's a normal part of our metabolic control. But as long as you're only insulin resistant for a short period of time, that's normal, that's good. We can't wake up in the morning without it. Our stress responses are very much about insulin resistance, and I'll cover that part next week. But if your baseline of insulin resistance keeps going up, then you have to produce more and more insulin in order to keep the blood sugar stable. And eventually what happens is, through one mechanism or another, you end up with problems in the pancreas and eventual dysfunction and death of the cells that produce this insulin. Now, why does this matter? This matters for a number of reasons. Okay? All of our current treatments and approaches for type 2 diabetes center around one of two things, or one of three things. Either reducing the amount of blood sugar that the liver releases, or increasing the amount of insulin, often in this case through actual insulin injections, or reducing insulin resistance by inhibiting the response for insulin resistance itself. These are what are fundamentally damage control mechanisms or approaches, and they are fundamentally aimed at preventing the progression of the illness. But as I said before, insulin resistance itself is a normal part of how our bodies regulate themselves. So the fundamental question that we need to ask ourselves is, why would you get a chronic response that our bodies are intended, or our bodies are evolved to handle only as an acute response? That's a very important question. Now, as it turns out, insulin is only one piece of the puzzle then, right? This is only the proximal piece for which the illness is something that we can measure and see. But there are obviously other hormonal systems involved as well, and those ones are the ones that regulate insulin resistance. Now, as you would have learned last week, blood sugar is extremely important for brain activity. So our blood sugar goes through cycles every day. It is lowest when we are deeply asleep in the middle of the night. It is highest typically in the morning, just after we've eaten breakfast. There are other things that can increase blood sugar as well, one of them being stress. We'll talk about that in a big part next week. But it turns out that there's a particular hormone involved in this process, and that hormone is called cortisol. It's produced in the adrenal glands right above the kidneys. And it does two things that are really critically important for this illness. Number one, it stimulates insulin resistance, and the second one is it stimulates blood sugar release by the liver. So cortisol follows a daily cycle. It's probably connected to our circadian rhythm, being asleep at night and awake during the day. And it's also critically important in our stress response. So cortisol is really, really important. We know that increases in cortisol secretion correspond almost exactly to increases in diabetes risk. We also know that people who work late night shifts are also at additional risk, just simply for working late night shifts. This is because these things stimulate the same sort of insulin resistance that when it gets out of control causes type 2 diabetes. And then we're secreting more blood sugar, we have to secrete more insulin, and the metabolic syndrome theory basically describes what we see from there on forward. At any rate, that's all I have for today. I'd like to remind you that if this content is interesting, I hope I've earned a subscription from you. Please comment, like, share, and subscribe to these videos. I think they're a really important topic. And as we continue to go into what we know about this illness, we'll be talking next week about stress management and the impact of stress on the development of this and management of this illness. This is something that the medical community is only now starting to come around to, though the scientific community has known about it for some time. And while this particular video is not of great interest perhaps for type 1 diabetics, it does lay the groundwork for a lot of material that is likely to be helpful there as well. I really, really believe in doing this series, so your support is very, very, very appreciated. Next week, I intend to cover cortisol in more detail. I intend to talk about the circadian rhythm, the importance of sleep, stress and stress management, and then how exercise fits into this. At any rate, thank you very much for watching, and see you next week.